The First Sheaf by H.R. Wakefield.
If only they realized what they were doing,
laughed old Porteous, leaning over the side of the car. They were a clutter of rustics, cuddling vegetable marrows, cauliflowers, apples, and other stuffs, passing into a village church some miles south of Birmingham.
Humanity has been doing that, performing that rite, since thousands of years before the first syllable of recorded time, I suppose, though not always in quite such a refined manner. Then there are maypoles of all indecorous symbols, and beating the bounds, a particularly interesting survival with, originally, a dual function. First, they beat the bounds to scare the devils out, and then they beat the small boys, that their tears might propitiate the rain goddess. Such propitiation having been found to be superfluous in this climate, they have ceased to beat the urchins, a great pity, but an admirable example of myth adaptation. Great Britain swarms with such survivals, some as innocuous and bland as this harvest festival, others far more formidable. At least, that was so when I was a boy. Did I ever tell you how I lost my arm?
No, I replied, yawning.
Go ahead,
but I hope the tale has some entertainment value, for I am feeling deliciously sleepy. Old Porteous leaned back and lit a cigar. He had started his career with £50 and turned this into 7 figures by sheer speculative genius. He seemed to touch nothing which did not appreciate. He is fat, shrewd, cynical, and very charitable in an individual, far-sighted way. A copious but discriminating eater and drinker, to all appearances just a superb epitome of a type. But he has a less mundane side, which is highly developed, being a devoted amateur of music, and he owns the finest collection of keyboard instruments in Europe. The only one of his many possessions. I greatly envy him. Music, indeed, was the cause of our being together that Sunday morning in August, for I make my living out of attempting to criticize it, and we were driving to Manchester for a hearty Sibelius concert.
When I was a boy of 13, he began, my father accepted the living of Reedley End in Essex. There was little competition of the curé, as the place had a notable reputation for toughness in the diocese, and the stipend was £250 a year, and a house which, in size and amenities, somewhat resembled a contemporary poorhouse. However, the prospect appealed to my dear old dad's zeal. Reedley End was in one of those remote corners of the country which are backwaterish to this day, and was then almost cut off from the world, as a village in Tibet. It sprawled along the lower slopes of a narrow valley, was 15 miles from a railway station, and its only avenue to anywhere was a glorified cart track. It was peopled by a strange tribe, aloof, dour, bitter, and revealing copious signs of intensive interbreeding. They greeted my father's arrival with contemptuous nonchalance, spurned his ministrations, and soon enough broke his spirit. I can do nothing with them, he groaned, half to himself, half to me. They seem to worship other gods than mine. There was a very real justification for their bitterness. Reedley End was perhaps the most arid spot in Britain. Drought, save in very good years, was endemic in that part of Essex, and I believe a bad spring and a dry summer still causes great inconvenience and some hardship to this day. There had been 3 successive droughts years before our arrival, with crop failures, heavy mortality among the beasts, and actual thirst being the result. The distress was great and growing, and a mood of venomous despair had come with it. The day of governmental paternalism had not yet dawned, and my father's predecessor's prayer for rain had been a singularly ineffectual substitute. They were off the map and left to stew in their own juice, or rather perish from the lack of it. Men in such a pass, if they cannot look forward for succour, many times look back. In February they went forth to sow again, and my father told me they seemed to him in a sinister and enigmatic mood. Oh, I may say my mother had died 5 years before. I was an only child, and through being my father's confidant, was old and wise before my age. Their habitual aloofness had become impenetrable, and all, even the children, seemed imbued with some communal purpose, sharers of some communal secret. One morning my father went to visit an ancient, bedridden crone, who snubbed him with less consistent ruthlessness than the rest of his fearsome flock. To his astonishment, he found the village entirely deserted. When he entered the ancient's cottage, she abruptly told him to be gone. "It is no day for you to be abroad, parson," she said peremptorily. "Go home and stay indoors." In his bewilderment, my father attempted to solve the humiliating mystery, and decided to visit one of the 3 small farmers who strove desperately to scrape a living for themselves and their hinds from the parched acres, and who had treated him with rough courtesy. His farmhouse was some 2 miles away, and my father set out to walk there. But on reaching the outskirts of the village, he found his way barred by 3 men placed like sentries across the track. They waved him back without a word, and when he made some show of passing, they grew so threatening that my father cut short his protests and came miserably home again. That night I couldn't sleep. My father's disturbed mood had communicated itself to me. Sometime in the course of it, I went to my window and leaned out. A bitter northerly wind was blowing, and suddenly down it came a horrid, thin cry of agony that seemed to have been carried from afar. It came once again, diminished and cut short. I crept, shivering and badly scared, back to my bed. If my father had heard it, he made no reference to it the next morning, when the village seemed itself again. My father had made valiant and pathetic attempts to get hold of the village youth, and managed to coax together a meagre attendance at a Sunday school. On the next Sunday, one of the dozen was missing. This was a girl of about my own age, the only child of a farm labourer and his wife. He was a foreigner, a native of Sussex, and a sparklingly handsome fellow of the pure Saxon type. His wife had some claims to be a beauty too, and was much fairer than the average of those parts. The result was an oddly lovely child, as fair and rosy as her father. She shone out in the village like a golden aureole in a crew of crows. She aroused my keenest curiosity, the bud of love, I suppose, and I spent much of my time spying on her from a shy distance. When she failed to turn up that Sunday, my father went round to her parents' cottage. They were both at home. The man was pacing up and down the kitchen, his face revealing fury and grief. The mother was sitting in front of the fire, wearing an expression my father found it hard to analyze. It reminded him of the appearance often shown by religious maniacs in their less boisterous moments, ecstatic, exalted, yet essentially unbalanced. When he asked after the little girl, the father clenched his fists and swore fiercely. The woman, without turning her head, muttered, "She'll be coming to school no more." This ultimatum was naturally not good enough for my father, who was disagreeably affected by the scene. He asked where she was. She'd been sent away. Well, where to? He asked. But at this she became a raging virago, and ordered my father to go and mind his own business. He turned to the man, who seemed on the verge of an outburst himself, but she muttered something my father couldn't catch, and he ran from the room. Late that night, my dad heard a tap on his study window. It was the father. "Sir," he said, "I'm away. They are devils here." "Your little girl?" my father asked, horrified. "They've taken her," he replied hoarsely. "I don't know why, and I don't know where she's gone, but I know I shan't see her no more. As for my wife, I hate her for what she's done. She says they'll kill me if I try to find her. They'd kill me if they knew I was here." My father implored him to tell him more, promised him sanctuary and protection, but all he said was, "Avenge her, sir," and vanished into the night. Naturally, my father was at a loss what to do. He even enlisted my more than willing aid, but all I succeeded in doing was verifying the agonizing fact that my darling had gone, and in taking a terrific beating from persons unknown one night when I was snooping near the cottage. In the end, my father wrote a confidential letter to the Colchester police, outlining the circumstances, but I suppose his tale was so vague and discreet that, though some inquiries were made by a thick-skulled, pot-bellied constable, nothing whatever came of them. But my father was a marked man from the moment of this peeler's appearance, and audible and impertinent interruptions punctuated his services. Realizing he was beaten, he made up his mind, with many tears and self-reproaches, to resign at the end of the year. The week after the little girl's disappearance, there was a lovely 2 days' rain, and the spring and summer were a farmer's Elysian dream. My father, with pathetic optimism, hoped this copious, if belated answer to his prayers would improve his status with the iron-fleeced flock. Instead, he experienced a unanimous and shattering ostracism. In despair, he wrote to his bishop, but the Episcopal Council was couched in too general and booming terms to be efficacious in converting the denizens of Reedley End. And one day, it was August, the fields shone with a mighty harvest, and it was time to bring it home. The valley divided the cornlands of Reedley into 2 areas. Those facing north were noticeably less productive than those on the south, and do not concern us. Those southern fields were open and treeless, with one exception, a comparatively small circular field in the very middle of the tilled expanse. This was completely hemmed in by evergreens, yews and holm oaks. Not a single deciduous tree interrupted the dark barrier. In the centre of this field was a stone pillar, about 8 feet high. I was forced to be by myself for many hours a day, and I spent many of them roaming the countryside and peopling it with the folk of my fancy. The local youth regarded me without enthusiasm, but young blood is thicker than old, and they did not keep me in rigid Coventry, though they were very guarded in their replies to my questions. The circular field stirred an intense curiosity within me, and all my wanderings on the southern slopes seemed to bring me sooner or later to its boundaries. Eventually I summoned up courage to ask a lad who had shown traces of cordiality if the field had a name. For some reason I was sure it had. He looked at me oddly, nervously and angrily, and replied, "It's the good field, and naught to do with you." After the little girl's disappearance, I was convinced vaguely, but certainly, that this field was concerned with it. Intuition, I suppose. "Now that," I interrupted him, "is a word that baffles me, and the dictionary seems to know no more than I do." "In a way, I agree," laughed old Porteous. "I could answer you negatively and quite accurately by saying that it is a mode of apprehension unknown to women. But I believe an intuitive judgment to be a syllogism of which the premises are in the unconscious, the conclusion in the conscious, though retrospective meditation can sometimes resolve it into a normal thought process. I have often done so in the case of big deals. It is the speed of the intuitive process which is so valuable.
and now I hope you are a wiser man. Anyway, I conceived a fascinated horror of the field, a shivering curiosity concerning it I longed to satisfy. One evening early in March, I determined to do what I had never dared before, walk out into the field and examine the stone pillar. It was almost dusk and not a soul in sight. When I'd surmounted a small but deep ditch, broken through between two yews, and stood out in that strange place under a hurrying, unstable sky, I felt a sense of extreme isolation. Not, I think, the isolation of being alone in a deserted place, but such as one would experience if alone and horribly conspicuous among a hostile crowd. However, I fought down my fears and strode forward. When I reached the pillar, I found it was square and surrounded by a small, cleared expanse of neatly tiled stone. This stone was thickly stained with what appeared to be red dust. I clasped the pillar with my arms, tucked my legs round it, and heaved myself up till I could touch its top. This I found to be hollowed out into a cup. I stretched up farther and pushed my fingers down. The next moment I was lying on my back and wringing my fingers, for if I had dipped my hand into molten lead, I couldn't have known a sharper scald. This emptied my little bag of courage, and with 0 at the bone, I got up and ran for it. As I stumbled forward, I took one look over my shoulder, and it seemed to me there was a dark figure standing by the pillar and reaching high above its top, and all the time I gasped homewards. I felt a follower, and the pursuit was not called off till I flung myself through the rectory door. "What's the matter?" asked my father. "You shouldn't run like that, and you've cut your hand. Go and bathe it." They started to reap in the second week of August, and I found the process of great interest, but it was the first harvest I had seen. I hovered about the outskirts of the activity, fearing my reception if I ventured nearer. I found they were working in towards the round field from all points of the compass. They reached it from all sides almost simultaneously by about noon on a superbly fine day, and then, to my astonishment, they all stopped work and went home. That was on a Tuesday, and they did nothing the next day in the fields, though they were anything but idle. There was incessant activity in the village of a sort which perplexed my father greatly. It struck him that something of great importance was being prepared. The hive was seething. Needless to say, no knowledge of it was vouchsafed to him. He discovered by humiliating experience that a meeting of the old men was held in what was known as O'Dew's field, for the sentries posted all the approaches to it brusquely and menacingly, and refused him entrance. Now, whether it was our friend intuition or not, I was convinced that these plans and consultations concerned the round field, and that something was due to be done there on the morrow, so I crept out of the house an hour before dawn, leaving a note on the hall table telling my father not to worry. I took with me 3 slices of bread and butter and a bottle of water. I made my way to the round field by a devious route, so as to avoid passing through the village, creeping along the hedgerows and keeping a sharp lookout with eye and ear. I have said that a ditch encircled the field, and in it I crouched down between 2 yews, well away from the gates. By creeping into the space where the branches touched, I believe I could spy out undetected. Dawn broke fine but very heavy and close, and there were red strata of clouds to the east as the sun climbed through them.
To my surprise, no one appeared at 6, their usual hour for starting work, nor at 7, 8, or 9, when I ate half my bread and butter and sipped the bottle. By 10 o'clock I had made up my mind that nothing would happen and I'd better go home, when I heard voices in the field behind me, and knew it was too late to retreat if I'd wanted to. I could see nothing ahead of me save the high, white wheat. But presently I heard more voices, and 2 men with sickles came cutting their way past me, and soon I could see an arc of a ring of them slashing towards the centre. When they had advanced some 50 yards, I had a better view to the right and left, and a very strange sight I beheld. The villagers, mostly old people and children, were streaming through the gates. All were clad in black, with wreaths of corn around their necks. They formed in line behind the reapers and moved slowly forward. They made no sound, not a single child's cry, but stared in a rapt way straight before them. Slowly and steadily the reapers cut their way forward. By this time the sun had disappeared, and a dense cloud bank was spreading from the east. By 4 o'clock the reapers had met in the centre, round the last small patch of wheat by the stone pillar, and there they stopped, laid down their sickles, and took their stand in front of the people. For perhaps 5 minutes they all stayed motionless, with bowed heads, and then they lifted their faces to the sky and began to chant. And a very odd song they sang, one which made me shiver beneath the yew branches. It was mainly in the minor mode, but at perfectly regular intervals it transposed into the major in a tremendous but perfectly controlled cry of exultation and ecstasy. I have heard nothing like it since. It seemed like the oldest song ever sung. The last fierce, sustained shout of triumph made me tremble with some unnameable emotion, and I longed to be out there shouting with them. When it ended, they all knelt down, save one old white-bearded man with a wreath of corn around his brow, who, taking some of the corn in his right hand, raised it above his head and stared into the sky. At once 4 men came forward, and with what seemed large trowels began digging with them. The people then rose to their feet, somewhat obstructing my view, but soon the 4 men had finished their work and stood upright. Then the old man stepped out again, and I could see he was holding what appeared to be a short iron bar. With this he pounded the earth for some moments. Then, picking up something, it looked as if he dropped it into a vessel, a dark metal pot, I fancied, and paced to the stone pillar, raised his right arm, and poured the contents into the cup at the pillar's top. At that moment a terrific flash of lightning cut down from the clouds and enveloped the pillar in mauve and devilish flame. And there came such a piercing blast of thunder that I fell backward into the ditch. When I'd struggled back, the rain was hurling itself down in such fury that it was bouncing high off the lanes of stiff soil. Dimly through it I could see that all the folk had prostrated themselves once more. But in 2 minutes the thunder-cloud had run with a squall, and the sun was blazing from a clear sky. The 4 men then bound up the corn in that last patch and placed the sheaf in front of the pillar, after which the old man leading the people paced the length of the field, scattering something from the vessel in the manner of one sowing, and he led them out of the gate, and that was the last I saw of them. Now somehow I felt that if they knew I'd been watching, it would have gone hard with me, so I determined to wait for dusk. I was stiff, cold, and hungry, but I stuck it out till the sun went down, and the loveliest afterglow I remember had faded.
While I waited there, a resolve had been forming in my mind. I had the most intense desire to know what the old man had dropped in the hollow on the pillar, and curiosity is in all animals the strongest foe of fear. Every moment that emotion grew more compelling, and when at last it was just not dark, it became overmastering. I stumbled across, fast as I could, to the pillar. Looking neither left nor right, I clambered up and thrust down my hand. I could feel small pieces of what might have been wood, and then it was as if my forefinger was caught and gripped. The most agonizing pain shot up my arm and through my body. I fell to the ground and shook my hand wildly to free my finger from that which held it. In the end, it clattered down beside me and splintered on the stone, and then the blood streamed from my finger, which had been punctured to the bone. Somehow I struggled home, leaving a trail of blood behind me. The next day, my arm was swollen up like a black bladder. The morning after, it was amputated at the shoulder. The surgeon who operated on me came up to my father in the hospital and said something to him. "I found this embedded in your son's finger," he said. "What is it?" asked my father. "A child's tooth," he replied. "I suppose he's been fighting someone with a very dirty mouth." "And that is why," said old Porteous, "though I have none of my own, I have ever since shown the greatest respect to the gods of others."